Hello, everybody. I'd really like to welcome you all to this seminar today and to our expert speakers and panel. We have here Dr. Sarah Cattan, Dr. Ava Lloyd, Ryan Shorthouse, and Dr. Rebecca Montacute. I'm delighted to be here at this 2021 Festival of Social Sciences with the IFS to chair what is a really important discussion on early years inequalities in the wake of the pandemic. I'm Carey Oppenheim. I work at the Nuffield Foundation, leading a project called The Changing Face of Early Childhood, which explores how young children's lives have changed over the last 20 years and what the research suggests about policy and practice priorities to improve young children's lives. So this is super useful for me, and I hope it will be for you. And prior to that, I was the first chief executive of the Early Intervention Foundation, which some of you will know. Now is absolutely the right moment to be having this discussion. Families with young children are stepping back into some aspects of normal life that were prior to the pandemic. Many, but fewer, are back in early years settings and in reception, seeing wider family and friends, but doing that with the legacy of a huge disruption in their learning, their communication skills, their emotional well-being, and for some, financial insecurity since the pandemic broke. And we are, and they are, still facing great uncertainty and anxiety. In terms of public responses to COVID, babies and young children have not been in the limelight. And we've had a decade of where there's been substantial reductions in funding for families with young children in particular. But the recent budget has announced some important steps forward: investment in childcare and early years entitlements, the best start for life and family hubs, issues that we might return to in the discussion. The task we've been set today is how to best address early childhood inequalities within the current spending envelope. So we thought we'd experiment and do a quick before and after poll on what you think the government's top priority to address early years inequality should be. So you'll find the link to the poll underneath the video on the website and YouTube. And if you haven't already voted, please do so during Sarah Cattan's presentation, and we'll reveal the results of the before poll before we go on to the panelists and have our wider conversation. So our first speaker is Dr. Sarah Cattan, known to many of you. She is Associate Director and Co-Lead of the Education and Skills Sector at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Her research focuses on the role of human capital and educational policy in reducing inequalities during early childhood. During the pandemic, she's run a real-time study on children's home learning experiences, and she's currently working on a project looking at the impact of the pandemic on the childcare market. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Carey. Thank you for this introduction. So in this short presentation, I'm going to provide some background for the discussion to come about how to best tackle early inequalities in the wake of the pandemic. I'm going to briefly summarize some of the evidence to date on the impact of COVID-19 on the lives and development of babies and young children. And this really will not be an exhaustive review of the evidence, nor even exhaustive discussion of all the issues we need to consider, but rather a chance to outline some of the key dimensions through which the pandemic has affected young children. And given the theme of the event on inequalities in the early years, I will pay particular attention to the ways in which the pandemic has affected young children from more and less advantaged backgrounds in unequal ways, and discuss implications of that for inequalities in their early development. So we wouldn't be discussing this topic if we didn't believe that early childhood was a key period for the development of children. There is much evidence to show that during the first 5 years of life, children are particularly sensitive to the experience and the environments that they are exposed to. And these experiences are very much shaped by the family, by the home environment, but also by experiences outside of the home, for example, in formal childcare and education. And the nature and quality of these experiences during those formative years are important for building children's school readiness and more broadly for helping children fulfill their potential throughout their lives. And so for these reasons, the early years are often seen as a period of great opportunity, but also a period of great vulnerability for those children exposed to poor, unsafe, and really more disadvantaged environments. So these inequalities in children's experiences early on are thought to play an important role in driving the gaps in development that we see between children from more and less advantaged backgrounds, these gaps emerging very early on and very much existing before the pandemic hit. So this disadvantage gap, or the developmental gap between more and less advantaged children, has been documented in many ways. And all this evidence really points to the fact that it is substantial. For example, data from the Department of Education in 2019 collected on pupils at the end of reception shows that disadvantaged pupils, those eligible for free school meals, were 4.5 months behind their non-disadvantaged counterparts, and this gap increases with age. And in the 2 decades before the pandemic, there were signs in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that actually this disadvantage gap was starting to shrink. But actually, since 2017, there have been indications that it started increasing again. So it is very much against this background of high inequality and potentially widening inequalities that the pandemic hit and brought radical changes to the lives of babies, young children, and their families. And many argue that those changes will widen those inequalities, have widened and will continue to widen those inequalities further without urgent action. So the pandemic combined a public health crisis with an economic crisis, and together these created a radical shock to every aspect of young children's ecosystem, starting with their families and extending to their care and education system. And so in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to reflect on the many ways in which COVID-19 has affected families with young children and the care and education system, and in how it's affected them, how it's affected young children unequally. You will notice, for example, that I will not talk much about the health system and how that has been disrupted for young children, but this is obviously a very important issue in its own right. So first, focusing on the impact of COVID on families. COVID has had a health impact, a social impact, and an economic impact. In terms of health, although the effects of the virus have been reported to be fairly mild for most young children, many of whom are actually asymptomatic, the risk to carers is greater, especially older ones, and especially individuals with prior health issues who on average tend to be more concentrated in disadvantaged households. In terms of the social impact, so for many months, social distancing measures that have been introduced to contain the spread of the virus have disrupted family routines and prevented much of the interaction that children would have with friends and extended family, and including informal childcare arrangements. Then the economic impact obviously cannot be understated. So by shutting down entire sectors of work and disrupting work arrangements, the pandemic has created a massive economic shock, leaving many families, especially low-income ones, with lower income and greater uncertainty about their future earnings and employment. Having children at home for longer because of school and nursery closures has also increased expenditures on items such as food and heating, and those have been most difficult to bear for poor families with young children. So reductions in income combined with increases in expenditures have meant increases in food poverty among low-income families and less income to spend on children's education and development. And even if policies such as the furlough scheme have prevented many families from experiencing more drastic changes to their income in the short term, the pandemic has still created a lot of job insecurity, which some argue have just as damaging consequences on families as job loss. So all these changes have created many new sources of stress for parents, and there is much evidence that parental mental health has worsened, especially among low-income families. But children, as a result of these changes, have also been spending more time with their parents. For some, it may have allowed for more opportunities for play and bonding between children and parents, but for other families, it may have been an additional source of stress among the many other worries created by the pandemic. So while overall, we would expect the experiences of the pandemic for families to have been quite varied with relatively mixed consequences for child development, families where parents were in low-paid jobs and living in more precarious conditions before the pandemic have certainly been hit the hardest, putting the development of their children at the greatest risk. Now, turning to the education and care system for young children, the pandemic has also completely shaken up that system. During the first lockdown between March and May 2020, nurseries were closed for most children. And even if they reopened faster than schools did and never closed again, nursery attendance drastically dropped in the earliest phases of the lockdown, and it has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels to date. And insights about this can be gained from various sources of data. So there is data on the number of children aged 0 to 4 attending earlier settings that was collected by the Department for Education. On this slide, I show the proportion of all 0 to 4-year-olds attending an early year setting between April 2020 and May 2021. And as you can see, obviously that proportion very much dropped very early in the pandemic, and it has sort of slowly picked up with a dip again, during the third lockdown. But still, as of the end of this graph, so May 2021, it was still below the estimated pre-pandemic level. And actually, the latest estimates from the DFE as of November 2021 suggest that still 1 out of 10 children expected to attend an earlier setting is not. We can also gain some insights about the groups of children that are more likely to be missing out on their early education by looking at how the take-up for different free entitlements has been changing among eligible groups. So as you know, the free entitlement for 2-year-olds is an entitlement to 15 hours of free care for the 40% of most disadvantaged 2-year-olds. In contrast, the 3- and 4-year-old entitlement is an entitlement to 15 hours of free care for all 3- and 4-year-olds. And so on this graph, you can see that the take-up of these entitlements among eligible populations was lower in January 2021 than it was in January of the 5 previous years. But we can also see that the drop in the take-up of is much more pronounced for the entitlement of the 2-year-old for the 2-year-olds than for the 3- and 4-year-olds. And so this would suggest that disadvantaged children are the ones to be most likely to be missing out on their early education and care as a result of the pandemic. And this may be particularly problematic for inequalities in their development, given that these are the children that are often argued to benefit the most from a high quality early education outside the home. So there are various reasons why this may be the case. Those reasons having to do with both the demand for childcare and the supply for childcare being affected by the pandemic. In a current project on the impact of COVID on the childcare market that I'm conducting with Eva Lloyd and several other researchers, we're actually trying to investigate what are the determinants of these changes in childcare attendance. So far, the evidence we have gathered would suggest that the demand for childcare is affected by the public health situation, corroborating some other evidence that parents actually respond to their perception of the risk associated, the risk of infection associated with sending their children to nursery. Obviously, another big factor is parental economic situation, and we see in the analysis that we've conducted that attendance is lower in areas with higher furlough rates and unemployment rates. And so going forward, given the uncertainty about the economic recovery and the possibilities of further lockdowns, it may be a long time until attendance go back to pre-pandemic levels, especially in more deprived areas. Of course, this depressed demand is having consequences for providers and increasing financial pressures on providers, some of which had already been present very much so before the pandemic. So if for the moment we haven't seen massive numbers of nurseries shutting down following the pandemic, there is evidence that closures may have been happening more, at least in rural areas. The pandemic has also been reported to have had detrimental effects on nursery workforce morale and mental health. And this will contribute to exacerbate difficulties that nursery leaders already had in recruiting and retaining quality staff. So while it is too early to tell what the long-run impact of COVID-19 will be for the babies and toddlers of the pandemic, the picture we have painted so far would suggest that it may widen inequalities in the development of children between those coming from more and less advantaged backgrounds. Because of the pandemic, the main measure of school readiness, the early years foundation stage profile, was not collected for cohorts who finished their reception year in 2020 and 2021. So we don't have a consistent series to look at how school readiness has changed, at least on this particular measure. But there is emerging evidence coming from other indicators of child development that would suggest that there has been already a detrimental impact of the pandemic on early child development. So for example, data collected as part of the Healthy Child program on indicators of development at age 2 to 2.5 shows that the proportion of children at or above the expected level of development was lower in 2021 than it was in 2019, with the greatest declines being around communication and language of children and personal, social, and emotional development of those children. Several surveys of parents, school leaders, nursery leaders are also showing increased concerns about the development of young children and their school readiness. For example, the study from the Education Endowment Fund shows that concerns among school leaders back in September 2020 suggested that particular concerns around the communication and language development of young children and around their personal, social, and emotional development. So this emerging evidence creates obviously cause for serious concern that the pandemic will widen socioeconomic inequalities in the early years, and this will obviously have knock-on effects for schools who already have their hands quite full dealing and helping children who were in school when the pandemic hit catch up on their missed learning. The extent to which these effects will be mitigated will obviously depend on the practices and interventions, old and new, that are put in place in nurseries, schools, and through the welfare system, really, to help families recover from the crisis. It will also depend on the speed at which children may be able to catch up from the learning they have missed during this time. And as you will have noticed, a lot of the issues I have discussed in this presentation in relation to early years inequalities are not new, and in many ways, the pandemic has only exacerbated them and made the policy response even more pressing. But in some ways, the pandemic has created also some new challenges. And so in thinking about this, I think this raises the questions of whether old ideas to tackle the inequalities are still relevant and how they need to be adjusted to address those new challenges brought by the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sarah, and it's really illuminating and worrying, and we'll come back to some of those issues that you've raised in our discussion. Shall we have a quick look at the poll? Greg, if you could share what people's initial view was of their priority. Okay, so let's just have a quick look. I'm just trying to get my screen up. Okay, so it looks as if so the sort of top priority is interestingly by making early education and care free for disadvantaged children from the age of 1. I mean, we're not talking about huge differences, and then followed by quality. So thank you very much for that. We will come back to that. I mean, it's 30. I think 37 of you participated. So, but it's very useful to have that insight, and we'll come back to you at the end. So let me now introduce our second speaker and first panelist, Dr. Eva Lloyd. She is a professor of early childhood at the University of East London and visiting professor at the University College London. At UEL, she's also director of the International Centre for the Study of the Mixed Economy of Childcare. And Eva's research focuses on the marketisation and privatisation of childcare and its relation to child poverty and social exclusion. She's also currently involved in a research project looking at the impact of the pandemic on the childcare market. So many thanks, Eva, and over to you.
Thank you, Carey. We know that early childhood education and care provision has the greatest benefits for children growing up with disadvantage. So the emerging findings from the study that Sarah and I are both working on about the various impacts of the pandemic on the attendance of children, of young children in early year settings, and the reduced take-up overall are particularly worrying. And of course, those are addressed in Sarah's conclusions. And I would like to take this opportunity to make 3 points. I will try very hard to make those points relate to being within the current spending envelope. I can't promise, but I hope to display some financial pragmatism here. And first of all, I want to say that, of course, the participation of disadvantaged children in early years provision pre-pandemic was already hampered by pre-existing structural problems with the system, our marketized system. And Carey Oppenheim herself and Nathan Archer recently described that as a dysfunctional market failing those that need it most. I couldn't have put it better myself, and they say that in one of the reports that have just come out from the Nuffel Foundation, the role of early childhood education and care in shaping life chances. So it's a mixed market of private for-profit, private not-for-profit and public providers. And within that market, over half of places are delivered by the private for-profit chains. And note that as far as the early education entitlement is concerned, 2 and 3, by far the majority of 2 and 3-year-old children get their early education within that market. A study also funded by the Nuffield Foundation into the nature of that market is about to be published. The report is called Acquisitions, Mergers and Debts, the New Language of Childcare. And I'm also a member of that research team. So I can tell you at the outset, I think a root and branch review of the whole system is needed. And I've written about that in various places recently. And it's also interesting that those pre-existing problems were identified by the National Audit Office in a report that was published on the 6th of March 2020. Now, that was a little unfortunate, perhaps, because it may not have received the attention it deserved. But the report, Supporting Disadvantaged Families Through Free Early Education, contained 5 recommendations which home in on a lot of these weaknesses. And I want to take you through one of them, which says the department should work with local authorities to develop a better understanding of the approaches that work best in increasing take-up of the entitlements by disadvantaged families. Now, that is needed now more than ever. Of course, a well-functioning and an effective early childhood system that meets its objectives does depend on an integration with wider family and public health policies. And that's why my first point, my first suggestion is that it is an absolute priority that we introduce a return of face-to-face meetings between health visitors and parents of under 5s. For the 5 mandatory health checks, and if at all possible, for more. Of course, you could say, but that will include all families. But you know the importance of the role of first midwives and then health visitors in identifying disadvantage, and the importance of the health visitor role in signposting disadvantaged families to early years provision and arguing the case for 2-year-olds going there, for instance. Now, my second point relates to the other side of the package, namely the uptake of additional childcare hours by working parents for children under 2, for 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, additional to the early education entitlement. And my focus is on the fact that the help that the government provides with the fees is done via retrospective payments. So parental childcare subsidies come after parents have paid the fees upfront and have acquired a proof of payment. And that goes for parents who get support through tax-free childcare and for parents who get support under universal credit. So let's focus on universal credit. Well, from both cases, in 2018, the Treasury Committee on Childcare already said in its report that it was a fundamental flaw in the system. It hasn't changed. In fact, it's got slightly worse, because in January of this year, the High Court ruled that this practice of proof of payment was unlawful. It was an interesting case brought by a single mother who won the case that she needed no more than an invoice rather than proof of payment. Otherwise, she really couldn't go on working, if she didn't get her universal credit payments. But of course, the Department for Work and for Pensions appealed, and the appeal was heard in July, and the Court of Appeal decided in favor of the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. The proof of payments had a reasonable foundation and was therefore justified. Now, the crux of the debate, the legal debate, was around whether this way of paying the money discriminated against women, because the majority of single mothers certainly are women. But I think the crux of this is that this policy discriminates against disadvantaged families. And therefore, my second point would be that I think that both HMRC and the Department for Work and Pensions should reconsider the proof of payment rule and accept invoices as sufficient for claiming contributions to childcare costs, at least then under universal credit. So reinstate the original High Court judgment. Now, I know providers may not like this, but I think there are risks, but not dangers, attached to this change for providers. And providers are actually quite well versed in getting rid of parents who run up debts or try to run up debts. And this really, looking at this matter, reminded me again about the change in the proportion of childcare support through benefits and the tax system, and as compared to the change that has taken place over the last decade in the support to the tax system and the early education entitlements. And Christine Farquharson has written in a brilliant 2019 briefing for the Institute for Fiscal Studies on early years funding. And she notes how spending through the tax system was up 85%, while spending through the benefit system had fallen by 44% in the last decade. This is, for me, one of the crucial things that needs to be addressed. And my suggestion about the retrospective payments is just one small piece in the jigsaw of trying to address this. And my final policy recommendation then goes to tax-free childcare, which of course is for better off parents, although more and more parents with young families, of course, are being reduced to having to apply for universal credit. And since its introduction in 2017, this has had a very low uptake. So Office of National Statistics told us in 2019 that at that point, there were 4.6 million UK households with working parents with dependent children. And half of those, 2.3 million, had one child under 5. And yet, by March 2021, only 282,000 families were using tax-free childcare. That does cover the year in which the pandemic started, but it has always remained like that. Another study from the Institute for Fiscal Studies for HMRC looked at the reasons that might be behind that and cautiously suggested that the tax-free childcare system's complexity and parents' lack of confidence with that complexity and so on might explain the low uptake. I think it's really urgent that we simplify applications for tax-free credit because they are highly complex. And I mean, absolutely, if I look at those forms, they make me hyperventilate. So I think my 10 minutes are probably just about up. So I will stop here and say that I look forward to discussing these questions further with you when we have our discussion at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Eva, both the surveying of the issues and the clarity and 3 very practical proposals about things that we can improve in the shorter term. So we'll definitely come back to it. Moving on, Ryan, our second panelist is Ryan Shorthouse, founder and chief executive of BrightBlue, an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. And Ryan's research focuses on education and social policy. He was previously research fellow for the Social Market Foundation, where he designed innovative policies on childcare, public service reform, higher education and health. Ryan's also senior visiting fellow at King's College London and a trustee of the Early Intervention Foundation, where we had quite close contact, and the Daycare Trust. So Ryan, over to you, and thank you.
Great, thank you, Carey, and thank you for introducing me and inviting me to speak here today on a very important topic, because I think the political focus has definitely been amongst COVID learning loss amongst school children. And we now have good evidence around that, 2 to 3 months on average, the learning loss, and particularly affecting deprived children and younger children. And the government also has, a solution around that, the National Tutoring Programme, where they've invested billions in it. So Kevin Collins, the Education Commissioner, did resign. Of course, he wanted the government to go above and beyond that by extending the school day. But my point is this, that around school children and the learning loss, there is an evidence base around it, about the extent of the learning loss, and there is evidence around the solutions that can help, and the government has acted on that. That's not the case with the early years, Although there is, of course, as we've seen in the IFS presentation from Sarah today, some nascent evidence around that learning loss, the extent of the learning loss amongst under fives. And the Healthy Child programme, for example, does show that on a variety of cognitive and social outcomes, we are seeing a decline in abilities for 2 to 2.5-year-olds over the period 2019 to 2021. So, but above and beyond that, I do think the evidence base needs strengthening. I know there are various organisations trying to do that, to look at the impact of COVID on learning outcomes. And I think particularly for older preschool children, looking what the impact is, particularly for 3 and 4-year-olds, where there is near universal take-up of early years, formal childcare, what the impact of nursery closures was on their development. But also, I think, just like with school children, we need to, for those of us who are passionate about early years, need to be presenting a set of remedial actions to help rectify this learning loss, just as those in the school children education sector have been doing. So what programs will help with catch-up, COVID catch-up? How much funding is needed? Who are the political figures like Sir Kevin Collins for education recovery who will really push for it? And we need to think about those programs both for formal childcare, but also for parental interventions as well, and family hubs. What sort of initiatives and programs do we need to remedy the learning loss? So getting the evidence on the learning loss and then pushing for the remedial policies, I think, should be a priority for those in the early years world. And this is crucial because obviously the pandemic has worsened the inequalities in early years, but we know they've existed for a long time. And we know that for changing the trajectory of child outcomes long term, it's not necessarily the only window. We shouldn't be deterministic about infancy, not least for parental stress and mitigating that. But also there's good evidence, for example, from Sarah Jane Blakemore at the UCL, that teenage years are also a kind of critical window for shaping brain development. But we do know from the evidence that the early years is the most critical, if not the only part. Leon Feinstein's evidence around, by the age of 5, child outcomes are closely, strongly correlated with educational outcomes at the age of 26. And obviously James Heckman's work in the US on the kind of complementarity of skill formation. The earlier you start, the more progress that you get in the long term. And considering the evidence around the impact of higher education on individual and social outcomes, and the impact that the early years has on educational trajectory, for me, it's, this is the most important part of the education process, and we should be investing much more in it. So above and beyond the remedial measures that I think are needed around COVID learning loss, what more can help reduce the inequalities? And we've already seen from the IFS presentation today that we did see a reduction in these inequalities in school readiness, what the government calls school readiness, between 2007 to 2012, and then it's increased again a little since 2017. The government, admittedly, I think, seems to have woken up a little bit more on early years. After a decade where children's centres have been scaled back and closed down, I think wrongly, considering there's stronger evidence that's emerged on the impact of children's centres, on the positive impact on child and parental outcomes, not least from the IFS, where people who were participating in children's centres less likely to be hospitalised, and obviously that also accrued savings to the health service as well. So after a decade of kind of political neglect, I think we're starting to see some turnaround, and Andrea Leadsom, I think, should be congratulated for that through her work around kind of the Healthy Start review. And of course, the budget has given more funding for improving early years training, for more money for providers to deliver the early years for entitlement, and also for family hubs, which are basically children's centres, but renamed and slightly a reprioritisation. And I think it's great that they're investing in family hubs stroke children's centres again. I mean, it's not just good for children and parental outcomes, but also for the levelling up agenda. And one part of that is around civic activity and social infrastructure. And I think children's centres and family hubs are a major part of that, because children are often the social glue. They are often a trigger for parents to come together and interact. So if you want more civic activity, then these sorts of things are really crucial for that. So there's good momentum that Andrea has created, which she deserves praise for. I think her focus is very much on the first 1001 days rather than all under fives. And I think it's really important as well that we definitely focus on the most evidence-based interventions to supporting children in the early years. So what sort of policies might help strengthen early years? Now, I think there's obviously a range of services and interventions which are crucial. I'm going to just focus now on preschool education, which is obviously one part of that. And as I said at the beginning, for me, preschool is not just a service, an important service for working parents, but is the most important service, most important part of the education system. And we need to be thinking about that much more. So I think there are three kind of issues that need tackling: affordability, quality, and sustainability. And on affordability, I think admittedly that has been the focus of successive governments as they've widened out the early years for entitlement, the number of hours, the eligibility, made universal credit childcare subsidy more generous, now at 85%, and also introduced tax-free childcare for higher income parents. Obviously the take-up is quite low with that. But I think that has been very much the focus of the government. And my view is that any additional state subsidy should now really be focused on quality and improving the quality of the workforce. The Nutt-Brown review did show that childcare remains a low status, low paid profession. So what do we need to do to really build up the quality and think about that? And then finally, on sustainability, there is a lot of churn in the market, lots of new openings, lots of closings, and that's including during the pandemic, but that's been going on for some time. I think the market is very localized, it's very contingent on parental circumstances in a local area. Therefore, it's very difficult for providers to achieve a kind of network of different childcare settings to create economies of scale. You know, as Eva said, a lot of childcare providers are in the PVI market, but they're very small. You know, not many are chains, and as such, you know, it's very vulnerable and fragile and localized, the market, and therefore it's hard to have sustainability. So what might help? So on quality, I would suggest that Kathy Silver evidence suggests that staff qualifications are the most important thing. So how do we get talented people into the early years setting? How do we make it a place that the most talented educators want to come to? Liz Truss looked at a kind of teach first scheme for early years educators. That's gone quiet. How can we revitalize that? What can we learn from what was done before to really boost the amount of talent coming in? What about salary supplements? The government's got that now for maths and science teachers, for school age children working in the most deprived areas. Could we think about salary supplements to attract the best educators into early years settings? And then how do we retain and attract good quality staff as well? And, you know, is worrying, for example, from the Nuffield Foundation presenting evidence that the average qualification level 3, has dropped over the last decade amongst the early years workforce. How do we build that up again? I mean, my view is, and I know this is quite controversial, but the issue around ratios, my understanding of the international evidence is that ratios, just like with school age children, staff to child ratios, that is less important than staff qualifications and quality, within reason, of course. If you do provide one carer to 50 children, then obviously that's a problem. But the UK has particularly strict ratios. I'd be up for relaxing those to some extent if providers spend more money on retaining and attracting high quality staff. I think that's something that we should seriously look into, considering my understanding of the evidence. On affordability, I think childcare could be made affordable overnight to everybody if we introduced income contingent childcare loans, just like with students who want to access university. This wouldn't replace existing childcare support through the early years for entitlement, UC, and tax-free childcare. It would be additional to it. It would be voluntary, so nobody's forcing parents to take it. It would be income smoothing, because you would only pay once you're in work and earning above a certain amount. And lots of parents are now going into debt already to pay for childcare. This would smooth the childcare costs over a longer period, thus making it, I think, more sustainable. And you can design it in a way, I think, which would be fiscally neutral. So if an interest rate was applied to it, you could charge higher income parents more to compensate for lower income parents who maybe don't meet the salary threshold for repayment and therefore don't pay as much of it back. But I would seriously consider it, because I think I've done polling on it. Parents of under fives across all social groups tend to be in favour of it, a majority, and would be interested in taking it up. And also the late Tessa Jow, when she was running for London Mayor, really pushed this idea as a solution. So like I say, not to replace existing funding, but to be complementary. And I think that would make childcare affordable overnight for parents. Which brings me to my final point, and I know I'm running out of time. So just very quickly on sustainability, I think the market, the demand for childcare needs to be thickened so it's less vulnerable and fragile to local parental circumstances. I think childcare loans would do that. It would make sure that the demand is less fragile. But in the end, I do think, and again, this is probably quite controversial, we should be moving to compulsory preschool education for 3- and 4-year-olds, taking the early years for entitlement, maybe for the 2-year-olds as well. You know, I think the school starting age or the education starting age is quite arbitrary. I think the evidence is strong enough of its impact to make it compulsory. But of course, to do that, we need to make it universally affordable and to make sure that there's quality provision everywhere. And then we're in that position. I do think that we should be moving to compulsory preschool education. This is not to undermine stay-at-home parents. I would do it for 15 hours a week. Kathy Silver's work seems to suggest that's optimal for child development. Anything above that doesn't seem to value add. So I would make it compulsory. And then, of course, if parents want to stay at home and look after their children, there's many more hours above 15 hours a week to do that. So there's some policy ideas, I think, for addressing the inequalities that have emerged from the pandemic and then beyond. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ryan, for that. Plenty of food for thought there. Some really interesting proposals that I hope we'll be able to come back to in the discussion. So thank you for that. I'll move quickly on to Becky. Becky Montacute is a Senior Research Fellow and Policy Manager at the Sutton Trust. She's authored a number of reports on a wide range of issues related to social mobility and educational inequality, including inequalities in the early years, the impacts of the pandemic on low-income students, unpaid internships, and inequalities in access to higher education. So, and actually also recently been involved in which I think you're going to talk about, particularly looking at options on the 30 hours policy in relation to early years. So over to you, Becky. Many thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak. So I'm going to start to just talk through a bit of the evidence that the Sutton Trust has found in terms of the impact and what we know so far on the impact of the pandemic on the early years, and specifically on kind of poorer children and what we can ascertain from that so far from our own research. So first off, I'd echo a lot of what's previously been said. What we've tried to do to add to the evidence for that is we carried out some polling both of parents and of primary school senior leaders to try to get a better understanding from their point of view of what the impact has been on preschool age children. So first off, as you'd probably guess, a lot of parents are really worried about the impact that the pandemic has had on their own children. So we found that 64% were worried about their child's development or well-being during the pandemic. And then in terms of schools and what schools are seeing, we did this polling in June this year, asking senior leaders to look back for this cohort of young people that entered reception in September 2020, so had been impacted by the pandemic. What were they seeing in terms of school readiness compared to what they would expect in a normal year? So we found that over half of them said that fewer pupils were school ready than what they would usually expect. And that in schools with the most deprived intakes, this was actually 67%. So we need a lot more evidence, and a lot of the future kind of research people have already mentioned is going to really add to this and better our understanding on what the impact has been. But it does really seem that at the moment there is a big impact in terms of what these schools are seeing, and that impact is unequal. And as we would expect, for all the reasons talked about at the beginning, that families have had really different experiences in the pandemic, that the home learning environment will be really different. There are good reasons to think that young children from poorer families will have had a larger impact. Then in terms of what that actually means to the schools going forward, those senior leaders are worried about lots of the kind of associated impacts. So 59% are worried about the increased strain that it could have on teachers, over half on the long-term impact on children's attainment, and 42% are worried about the potential for increased staffing costs to be able to deal with that lack of school readiness as those kids go through the school system. So this is something that is going to have an impact likely on these children throughout their time in education. So it is really important that we act early to be able to actually prevent that from being a kind of longer term impact where we can for those children. Also, really importantly, the clear majority of the senior leaders that we polled, 93%, said they felt that more time in early years provision before children start in reception helps to support school readiness, and 71% said they felt that it helped considerably. So making sure that children have access to, as we've heard already, that kind of high quality early years provision before they start at school is really important. So I'd absolutely echo the points that Ryan made previously about this generally not being as much of a political issue so far as what we've seen in schools, and absolutely agree that it should be something that is really being thought about in part of the pandemic recovery. And I'd like to make a case for why I think the 30 hours is a really good place to do that, partially because of the age range we're talking about, 3 and 4 year olds, that those are people who over the next few years, today's 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds will be going through that system if you changed it at this point. And where those very young children have been impacted by the pandemic, that is a point that we have the opportunity to make a change. Whereas if you were to do things, say, in changing provision for today's 1-year-olds, quite quickly you'd be getting to the point where you're not having, fingers crossed, depending on what happens with the pandemic next, people that have had those really kind of severe pandemic impacts going through the system. But also because the current 30-hour policy is just simply very unfair in terms of who's able to access it. So at the moment, for those who aren't aware, when young children are 2 years old, they are able to access, if they're from a disadvantaged family, 15 hours of early education childcare per week. So that is us as a society recognising that those young people live in challenging circumstances, and it would be beneficial for them to have additional hours. But then when we get to the ages of 3 and 4, that focus shifts. So rather than disadvantaged children getting more hours, they are actually now able to access fewer hours because of the 30-hour entitlement and the way it's designed. So there are requirements around working families for people being able to access it. They have to meet certain criteria around their working hours. And I'm going to give another shout out to Christine from the IFS, who did the economic modelling on this. But she found from looking at who's able to actually claim the entitlement in the existing criteria that just 20% of families in the bottom third of the earnings distribution are eligible for the existing entitlement. So we wouldn't accept this for schools. We wouldn't say that at school age, it would be acceptable for the state to provide more hours of kind of funded school time for richer families. But that is exactly what we're doing in the early years. And we think that that is a major mistake. In terms of the evidence to actually make a change for this, well, first off, and obviously this is, correlation, not causation, but we know that since the 30-hour entitlement was actually brought in, that a gradual slowing of and kind of closing of the attainment gap in the early years has actually started to widen out again. And we know that there's good evidence, as has been discussed, that time and quality early years settings is beneficial for children's outcomes. Now, I want to address directly the point that Ryan made in terms of the number of hours and whether or not they are, more than 15 hours is needed. First off, the point I'd make for that is that while the kind of headline policy is called 15 hours per week, 30 hours per week, in reality, it's not that many hours because it's only during kind of school term time, not the summer holidays. So 15 hours per week is not actually 15 hours per week every week of the year. And 30 hours per week is not 30 hours every week of the year. In terms of the exact number of hours that would be beneficial, to be honest, we don't have good enough evidence at the moment. And I think more research here would be really helpful. But we, as part of this Fair Start project, conducted a really large literature review looking at the existing evidence. And it seems that somewhere between 15 and 25 hours from over the age of 2 is beneficial as long as it's of a high quality, and that the really negative impacts tend to be seen over 35 hours. So in terms of getting us to the majority of children having the same number of hours of entitlement and having a number of hours that's likely to be beneficial, I think there is a really clear case for extending the 30-hour entitlement, because it won't actually be 30 hours in terms of what they're accessing per week. And also, just politically, realistically, I don't think you're going to get a situation where the government will take away hours from parents who already have them. Whereas I think you could get a situation where that current entitlement is extended to those poorest families. So I think politically, realistically, perhaps fewer hours would be okay, but I just don't see that you're going to get an actual reduction of that in terms of the actual policy. So extending and making the 30 hours universal, I think, would be the best way to go. They are already doing this at the moment in Scotland. It's just about to it's like in the process of happening at the moment. And I think looking at that and seeing what the impact of that is will be really important. Now, again, Christine did some modelling to look at the costs of this. And there is a lot of uncertainty around this because it depends a lot on take up and whether or not people take up new entitlements at the same level that they've taken up previous entitlements or not. But on the kind of central scenario that she modelled, she estimated that it would cost about 250 million per year to be able to make it universal by 2024-25. So, that does sound like a lot, but to keep in mind that the existing entitlements actually cost 735 million. So to be able to bring people into that entitlement, it's actually not that large an increase on the existing spend. And there are ways to do it cheaper. You could just bring only deprived children in, and that would cost about 165 million a year, again, with that uncertainty around the exact amount of the cost. And you could reduce eligibility on the top end. So if you brought it down to a per parent cap of 50,000 a year, you'd save about 100 million a year. So there are ways to make it cheaper. But if you did do that, I think you'd lose a lot of the benefits. First off, to kind of just about managing families who really could benefit from this kind of provision. But if you extended at the bottom end and cut off at the top end, there would be still some of those people in the middle who wouldn't be eligible if we, say, used the existing 2-year-old disadvantage criteria, but also that you just make it a lot more complicated for families. And one thing, even within existing funding, I'd really advocate that people could do is just make it less often that people have to reapply for the entitlement. And that could really help. But I think making it universal could be really beneficial to take up as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky. We're quite tight for time, and we'd really like to draw on other people. That's really interesting and very useful and interesting to hear the arguments for the 30-hour change, particularly in the light of the pandemic. So just to remind people, do vote anytime between now and the end of our session, and then we'll have a quick look at the poll. And please do use a Slido for any kind of questions that you have that we can ask the audience, ask our panelists to respond to. I wanted to just ask. I mean, I think Ryan, you put some really interesting and challenging kind of proposals up. I'd be interested to know, perhaps starting with Sarah, about how you respond to the proposals that Ryan has raised in relation to the balance about improving quality, some of the idea around loans in relation to trying to improve affordability, and interestingly, sort of the issue around compulsory provision. Once we get to a stage that the quality, if quality is good enough and there is universal provision. Sarah, would you just share any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share any sort of immediate reactions like to this. I thought this idea of the income contingent loans was actually really interesting. It very much sort of I think takes seriously the idea that early education is an investment for families to make in their children's human capital, and that families may be constrained financially. Some families are constrained financially for making that sort of investment, and this is a really important issue, and that sort of system I think could definitely sort of solve that. I'm wondering if there are examples of countries that have this sort of system that we could sort of learn from. One sort of immediate issue I was thinking about, and I'd love to hear Ryan's sort of thoughts on that, is again around the issue of take-up and whether we might again sort of see, the gaps that we already see, between sort of families that are a bit more far removed from the system and sort of feeling a bit reluctant, to take on some debt for the education of their children, and how we could sort of work around those issues to provide reassurance and to really work on the information that we're providing to these families so that this is a successful policy.
Ryan, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's very good points. I mean, internationally, there isn't any other examples, unfortunately. I hope we can be a pioneer, but who knows? And then on the second point around sort of debt aversion amongst low-income families, which you're right, is a problem. And we need to think very carefully about it. I don't want to get massively into the debate around student loans, but there's obviously evidence showing that if children, young people at the age of 18 get the grades, they tend to go to university. There isn't the debt aversion. However, there may be debt aversion earlier on, which impacts how they view their education trajectory and maybe the feeling that they're not going to go to university. So we do need to be careful about that. But of course, what I'm proposing is not a mortgage style loan. It's an income contingent loan, and therefore if a parent is not earning enough, they don't pay it. It's progressive in that sense. They're protected. But I can bang on about that for hours on end, but I still get that there will be some sense that there's debt aversion, and there's problems with that also in the student loan model. So we need to think very carefully about how we communicate it.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think it's really interesting about, Ava, you had, some points about how to address some of the issues on how we subsidise childcare and some sort of issues in the system that actually feel like they're quite resolvable. And so I wonder whether, is there a way of doing some simplification of the funding of the sort of demand side for childcare, that could include a look at loans, but also looking at whether we're using the funding in the best possible way, because it's highly complex. I don't know what Ava, what you think about that, or others want to respond to.
Well, I don't want to repeat my point about retrospective payments. I think most well-functioning systems across Europe expect parents to pay income-related fees, although, of course, within the EU, we've now got the recommendation accepted of the child guarantee, which will mean that poor children or children at risk of poverty get all their public services free, and well, we're not in the EU anymore, but I think that there is something else in that point that Ryan made about the loans, which is to do with the way we view the system and we view children within their system. I think the early childhood education and care system makes a contribution to the public good, to the well-being of society as a whole and the well-being of the economy. And the approach with the loans, that does seem to go back to children as entirely a private responsibility of parents, don't have them if you can't afford them type of thing. So that's what I'm worried about. I do think the system should be more generous. We can't easily go back on the fact that a proportion of it is free, but in most European countries, at least 1 year, if not 2, are free.
Yes, although, Ryan, you made very clear that this is on top of existing payments for entitlements. So I guess it's about the balance between public and private funding of early years in childcare, but it's a point well made. I also wanted to ask you, Sarah, you gave this very kind of comprehensive, really interesting analysis of the impact of COVID on young children. And there was really consensus across the panelists about the significance of the impact. Is there anything else that we should, and I think you raised this in your last slide, Sarah, is there anything else that COVID has thrown up, which actually makes us rethink how we should respond? Are there other particular things about COVID which actually, where the pre-existing things we thought about in response to the challenges of inequalities in the early years are not sufficient? Maybe Becky, you might want to start with that.
I will say one of the things that's concerned us as we're coming out of the pandemic is the number of providers who've ended up closing because of the economic pressure. And I think given the importance of the early years, there is this question of, how can you have this system, I guess, where private providers are able to just end up collapsing if there is some kind of emergency like this, or even has been talked about kind of local pressures. And what does that say to us more generally about how importantly we're thinking of the early years system, that it is able to have that happen, but also now how do we address that because it has happened?
Yeah. Is there some way of kind of increasing the security for those particularly for those vulnerable providers and where they are? Any other? Any of you want to come in on Sarah? I can see you demuting.
Yeah. I just perhaps wanted to go back to something I mentioned quickly during my presentation, which is, this evidence sort of emerging that maybe the strongest impacts of COVID are on the emotional and social development of children. And so, although that's always been, an important domain, I think, of development, there has been a lot of focus on academic achievement and sort of school readiness, even though school readiness obviously includes emotional, social, and personal development. There's been a lot of focus on numeracy and language skills. And I think perhaps for older children and for adults, the pandemic has, I think, strengthened the case for well-being, for caring about well-being, for caring about mental health. I don't know if the policy solutions have already been developed enough, but I think for very young children, perhaps I think the pandemic is also shining some new light, I think, on this very, very important domain of development. And it isn't clear, I think, that early education and care can completely be the solution to this issue. also has a lot to do with what is going on in the home, the parenting practices. And this is where I think we should really be thinking about, more family support sort of interventions like family hubs that have been, mentioned by our panelists, as playing potentially a very important role to strengthen that aspect of child development.
Yes, I think that really resonates with me, so I wonder whether how far could family hubs or other sorts of interventions start to take a more sort of rounded view in terms of supporting young children as they're trying to sort of settle into the early years, or do other people have a particular view about what we should be doing?
If I may come in, I really think that the issue that has already been raised by Ryan about the workforce becomes absolutely crucial, because whether it's a children's centre or a family hub or a private for-profit day nursery, it all depends on the quality of the workforce and the lack of turnover and so on, whether the children actually benefit from participating in the services on offer. So this, again, in the limits of what we can do here today, this is a very big topic, but it is absolutely crucial. Just an example, Ireland has just announced in its latest budget, and they had a comprehensive spending review as well, that it will pay core funding to providers, with a specific purpose of raising the pay and conditions of the staff working there, which is bad like it is here. But we are, across the board, we have in the private sector compared to the schools, where the smaller proportion of our children get mostly part-time early education, 2, 3 and 4-year-olds in school. We have some of the lowest paid workers in our economy.
Yeah. So sort of the stability of the workforce as being as a fundamental starting point. But then I guess there's an interesting question about the kind of range of skills and training and support and the relationship, I think, between the early years sector, the early years and education and childcare, and what goes on at home. But I do think family hubs are potentially, depending on how policy develops, potentially a way to do some of those things, bring some of the learning from Sure Start. Our time, I'm afraid, is really vanishing, and we've really just begun. I think I think we should just go back to the poll to see whether those people who've been listening to your wise and I think really thoughtful contributions have made any change in their priorities. So, Greg, could you share with us both what people said originally and what they're saying now? Okay, so that's what they said at the beginning. And show us. Okay, so that's interesting. We've got a clearer, yes, so we've got more people saying that this this first stage of life for children who are disadvantaged from the age of 1, making early education and care free for this particular group. Oh, it's changing as we speak. It's 35%. And then the others fall below. So it's just interesting. We didn't talk that much about this. Oh, still changing. We didn't talk that much about that very early phase, but it is interesting to reflect that actually the best start for children in Andrea Ledsam's work didn't address childcare because that was out of scope. And I think there's a real great case for the importance of thinking about how these services work together, whether they're integrated in terms of children's centres or family hubs, or just much better coordination, and that we think about things across the piece. It's still changing. So I think we're going to have to stop. In terms of the poll, I think it's just quite nice to see what people's views are. Thank you to all of our speakers. I think the thing that stands out very strongly for me is to reiterate this incredibly important phase of life, and that the pandemic has shown us, in a sense, just how important it is, and that we do really need to think about how do we both build the evidence base and elevate this in public debate, so that as we think about how we come out of the pandemic, we use both our existing tools and new ways of addressing those inequalities, those very worrying disadvantages that we see happening in terms of children's development at this really critical stage. And I think there was, that seemed to be a consensual view across the piece. And we'll need further discussions to decide and talk about priorities. But thank you to all of you for your time and for the discussion, and we'll continue the conversation.